Does creation carry God's fingerprints, opportunities and challenges in using natural theology or design arguments? Here's what I'm intending to do. Ask what is natural theology, give a brief history of natural theology, talk about the challenge to natural theology from within theology itself, because it hasn't always been popular. It's had quite a checkered history in many ways, but there's been a challenge not only from without, but from within. Some of the arguments in natural theology, which are very alive today, and in particular, the argument from cosmological fine-tuning, which I've done quite a lot on, and then summary. Here's John Polkinghorne, the late John Polkinghorne, inspirational man, to me in particular, but to lots of us in the science and religion field. He defined natural theology in this way. One may define natural theology as the attempt to learn something of God from the exercise of reason and the inspection of the world. In other words, from reflection on general experience rather than from specific revelatory events. So there's this distinction between the two kinds of knowledge that we gain from general experience and that we gain from revelation. Though I would argue that you can't separate them too rigidly. As I say, there's a long history to natural theology, and here's a major figure, St. Thomas Aquinas, back in the 13th century, who said this. He said, "The truths about God which St. Paul says we can know by our natural powers of reasoning, that God exists, for example, are not numbered among the articles of faith, but are presupposed to them." So that God exists, we can know purely by reason, according to Aquinas. God's effect can serve to demonstrate that God exists, he says, even though they cannot help us to know him comprehensively for what he is. So there is the much more important knowledge of God as Redeemer in Christ, and not simply God as Creator. Now, coming towards the Reformation, Calvin talked about there being in humans a sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine, or a semen religionis, a seed of religion, that we have a natural inclination to believe in God, which is rather interesting in the light of some modern work done by Justin Barrett on childhood belief. So again, there is the knowledge of God as Creator, but also the important, more important knowledge of God as Redeemer, that kind of distinction. So then we move on. Yeah, as time developed, we got more into the period of the scientific revolution, so-called, though there was plenty of science done in the Middle Ages, that tends to get forgotten. As we get into the 16th and 17th century, natural theology changed a bit from being the kind of general arguments that Aquinas had, arguments from first cause and that sort of thing, to specifics. And one kind of example is looking at a fly's eye and then looking at human artifacts and to see the beautiful pattern that you get in the fly, but the kind of rough edges and so on of a needle made by humans. So there's this aesthetic kind of argument from nature compared with human creation. Then there were a couple of extremely important philosophers who criticized natural theology. One was Immanuel Kant, and he argued that there isn't really order in the world out there to build a case on for natural theology, but we impose order. It's our minds that impose order on what we perceive. I think many modern scientists would find that very strange. You know, it's not part of a human construction that space-time is curved, or that we have very peculiar effects of non-locality, or whatever it might be in quantum theory. These things hit us from the outside. We're not really perceiving the order. And he also said that a cause of an observable event must be observable. Well, again, many scientists would say that that's not the case. We're observing, we're observing the effects, but without observing the object itself. For example, when we look at tracks in the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, find the Higgs boson, we don't see a Higgs boson, we see effects of that object. So again, these are philosophical notions, but I think modern scientists would not really quite agree. Hume, that's me beside David Hume in Edinburgh, this great monument to this Scottish philosopher of the Enlightenment. He was described as the most profoundest negative thinker on record by John Stuart Mill, and certainly he was negative towards Christian belief, particularly in this book, Dialogue Concerning Natural Religion. He argued that there's a lack of analogy between artifacts and natural phenomena. Well, what we saw in Hooke was actually the natural phenomena in many ways much more beautiful than the artifacts. But a lot of modern argument isn't really by analogy anyway. It's more asking, well, what's the best explanation of this? You know, this, for example, that natural laws are described by beautiful mathematics. Is that just a random thing, or is it because there's a God? And, we're not really arguing by analogy. He did also raise the question, well, okay, maybe one God, but why not many gods behind the creation? And again, well, in science, we would normally go for the simplest explanation, using the least number of entities to do the job, so-called Occam's razor principle. And one is a lot simpler than some random number like 376 or whatever it might be. And it also, the universe seems to be described, the laws which describe the behavior of matter and energy in the universe seem to apply across all of space and time, from the tiniest fraction of a second from the beginning to across all the galaxies and so on, to today, so across space and time. And then he thought, well, universes could be generated from other universes. And again, that kind of question had been answered before. Here is Leibniz, great philosopher who had this principle of sufficient reason. There needs to be a reason why things are. Here's what he said. And he had this interesting example of geometry books. He said, well, suppose a book of the elements of geometry had existed from all eternity, and in succession, one copy of it was made from another. Well, you can say why one particular geometry book exists. It was copied from the previous one. But why do geometry books exist at all? Why does anything exist, let alone geometry books? So that question, it seems, remains. And we'll come back to that idea. These philosophical critiques didn't really do away with natural theology or hold it up, as it happens. It kind of came to a peak with William Paley in his 1802 book, Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, collected from the appearances of nature. I suppose he did have an analogy, the watch, famous picture of the watch, so he wasn't inhibited from doing that. he found a watch on a heath, and he thought, well, if you look at that, it's obviously designed, the intricacy of it and so on, so much more the eye with which we're looking at it. And it wasn't really the philosophical arguments that defeated that argument so much as Darwin, who came along and explained how eyes could evolve from simpler structures. And it's usually thought that Darwin defeated natural theology, or this kind of natural theology. But we need to be a little bit careful. Here is Frederick Temple, who became Archbishop of Canterbury. He, well, one of the things he was famous for was for preaching in 1860 at the University Church in Oxford, when there was held the famous debate between Thomas Huxley and the Bishop of Oxford. That's gone down into notoriety. But Frederick Temple had no, Huxley was defending Darwin, and Wilberforce was, Bishop Wilberforce was putting arguments against. But Temple was very pro-evolution. He found no problem with it whatsoever. And what he said is this, which is relevant to the design argument of natural theology. What is touched by this doctrine of evolution is not the evidence of design, but the mode in which the design was executed. In the one case, the Creator made the animals at once, such as they now are. In the other case, he impressed on certain particles of matter such inherent powers that in the ordinary course of time, living creatures such as the present were developed. He did not make things, we may say, no, but he made them. That goes back to St. Augustine in about 400 AD. It's not actually altogether new that God had impressed on matter the power to produce living creatures and so on. Okay, but back to Paley. He actually wasn't as naive as we might think, and indeed it wasn't just the watch analogy. He had more general arguments as well, which tend to get forgotten. I mean, one of the general arguments, interestingly enough, is that the law of gravity has to be inverse square. You know, 1 over r squared, the law that Newton discovered. And it has to be that way, otherwise planetary orbits would be unstable. That's an argument that's as relevant today as it was then. That is that's one of the fine tunings that I'll talk about. And he did talk about, well, what if watches were generated by watches? What if they even changed slightly as they were generated? And you would still need to explain why there are watches. And there's a curious analogy here with Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. Dawkins, the famous atheist, who said, he described how evolution works in this way. He had a computer screen on which he displayed these objects which he called biomorphs. And he had some rules about how the biomorphs would generate the next generation of biomorphs. So his screen changed, and then you got new creatures looking slightly different from the previous ones. And he said, hey, presto, that's evolution. That's how it all works. You don't need God. But I mean, the fallacy of that argument is blatant. Who wrote the computer program? Who devised the algorithm by which the biomorphs evolve? I'm not quite sure why Dawkins himself couldn't see that. And natural theology hasn't died a death. There have been these lectures called the Gifford Lectures on Natural Theology, established in 1888, and they continue to this day. Interestingly enough, the recent ones were given by Tom Wright, so they've moved into actual what's becoming in some circles known as ramified natural theology, arguments with the particularities of the Christian religion, historical arguments, which work just as well as arguments from nature, in fact, if not better, and more important. But these lectures were designed for promoting, advancing, teaching, and diffusing the study of natural theology. I mentioned the challenge from within, and here is the famous Protestant Reformed theologian Karl Barth. He thought that natural theology was, well, goodness me, I mean, he almost blasphemous in his words. He said, even if that's meant to be, even if we only lend our little finger to natural theology, there necessarily follows the denial of the revelation of God in Jesus Christ. It's trying to get God on our own human terms, according to Barth, rather than on God's terms, which is through the person of Jesus Christ. And we have to think about the context of Barth's view here. He felt that the liberal theology of the 19th century on which he'd been brought up was bankrupt when a number of his teachers signed the declaration of academics in support of the Kaiser's war aims in World War I. That, because all these liberal theologians had signed this, that was for Barth the end of liberal theology. And what you had to do was then go back to the Bible. Then there was also the context of the rise of the Nazis. Barth was a major figure in the Confessing Church in Germany, which stood out against Nazism. And he thought that the Nazis were doing a kind of natural theology. He saw them as corrupting Luther's original views of the orders of nature, such as family and marriage. They were corrupting these and introducing race as an order given in nature, and with the German race superior and displacing the Jewish race and so on. And he saw all that as a kind of natural theology. Now, for me, it's all rather overdone. I think Barth was powerful in his context as insisting that there's the one authority we obey, namely Jesus Christ. And he wrote pretty much single-handedly, we're told, the Barmen Declaration of the Confessing Church, which laid out who we should obey and who we should not obey in the world. Very critical of the Nazi regime. But there's a problem. And the problem is, there's a chap called James Barr who put this forward in a very good book. Natural theology is in the Bible. And Barr says, if the Bible accepted or implied natural theology, Barth's argument falls to pieces. The word of God, as attested in the scriptures, must then include natural theology as part of revelation, or as the background to it, or as an implication of it, or mode through which it is communicated. And of course, you can look at a number of passages in scripture, Acts 17 particularly, where Paul is explaining to the Athenians about what it would seem that they already know. They know, well, they worship the unknown God, and Paul is filling out for them what that means. And he's quoting Greek poets and writers and so on. In doing so, in him we live and move and have our being. That's from a Greek poet. And then there's Romans 1:19-20. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made. Psalm 19 in the Old Testament, the heavens declare the glory of God, and it seems they declare that glory to everybody. It's not just to the chosen people of God. So if natural theology is in the Bible, then that would seem to justify it. And it is, if God is, if God is the author of nature, after all, if he is the creator, then one might expect to find fingerprints. Where do we go from here? So some of the arguments that are used in natural theology. There is the cosmological argument, which I've hinted at, that a reason why the universe itself exists, even if universes are made from other universes, which in some modern models of cosmology they have done. You've had big bangs followed by big crunches followed by big bangs. That's not a popular one at the moment, doesn't seem to work anyway. But even if that were the case, then you would need you would need a reason for why the universe exists. It's the fine-tuning argument, which I'll go to in a bit more detail in a moment, so I won't say any more about that. Well, there's the fact that the universe is ordered at all. And it's an order that we as human beings can discover. I think that can be explained by the fact that we're made in the image of God, the Imago Dei. We have the capacity to understand the laws of nature. I remember reading when Jenner discovered the smallpox vaccine, I think it was. Anyway, he said, well, he wasn't worried that people weren't thanking him for doing that, but surely they should be thanking God for giving humans the capacity to discover vaccines. We can discover the laws of nature. Consciousness, which is a baffling problem in philosophy and in well, science, neuroscience, and so on. Why are we conscious? Why aren't we simply zombies? And then the fact that we are creatures with reason, who can exercise reason and a moral sense. I mean, there's an argument that C.S. Lewis made about reason. Well, if we're just playing out some kind of computer program and our capacity has come from unreason in the sense of chance processes and so on, how can we rely on it? And a moral sense as well, of right and wrong. This is a chap who's a major pioneer of modern natural theology today. He's the retired professor of the philosophy of religion at Oxford, Richard Swinburne, and he's made a cumulative argument from some of these kinds of features. Religious experience is another one. One of the things I should say is that when looking at these arguments, it's important to look at the alternatives. What alternatives does an atheist have, and why would invoking God be a better argument than atheism? So that's an important thing to do, and I'll look at that with the fine-tuning in particular in a minute. With the cosmological argument, virtually all you can do is say, well, it just is. The universe is just a brute fact. You can't go any further, which I think, well, if you're a scientist, don't you find that dissatisfying? We look for explanations. Okay, well, I'm going to talk about my own speciality, the Big Bang and cosmological fine-tuning. I've got a picture here of people. Pretty sure you'd recognize Einstein there. But the other figure may not be so well known unless you're in the field, but he's one of the greatest cosmologists of all time. He is a chap called Georges Lemaitre. He was a Catholic priest, as you can see, and I sometimes wear the collar when I'm officiating and so on. I can see Phil is wearing a dog collar, I think. He was a Catholic priest, but he was also a cosmologist. And he predicted from Einstein's equations of general relativity, that's Einstein's theory of gravity, that the universe would be expanding. Expansion was observed a couple of years later. And then again, he came up with a solution in which not only was it expanding, but it was expanding from something like a dot, a point, a highly compact initial state, which he called the primordial atom, and which Fred Hoyle, a famous Cambridge atheist cosmologist, called the Big Bang. And he hated the idea, but we'll come back to Hoyle in a minute. So the Big Bang was predicted by Lemaitre, and it's extremely well supported by the evidence. There was this initial expansion, and then there was the cosmic background radiation discovered in 1965 by these chaps working at Bell Telephone Laboratories, Penzias and Wilson. I was at a conference in Rome commemorating the 50th anniversary of the death of Lemaitre, would it be? Yes, that's right. And one of the interesting things is that he learned about this cosmic background radiation on his deathbed as being discovered. It was predicted by American cosmologists as the remnant radiation from the Big Bang. At the Big Bang, matter, energy, it was all very hot, and as the universe has expanded, it's cooled down. So and it's then left this 3 degrees above absolute zero radiation, minus 270 Celsius, cold out there. Now, that's just a brief picture of the Big Bang. It's an expanding universe. Galaxies form as the universe expands because there are instabilities and gravity takes hold and forms the galaxies, and within the galaxies, stars and planets and so on. Greater, then the universe would collapse far too quickly for anything interesting to happen, because gravity would pull it back. If it were below this critical value by more than this amount, then the universe would expand far too quickly for anything interesting to happen, for the galaxies to form and so on. So that's a high degree, very high degree of accuracy. Then there's the strength of gravity itself. Well, you can actually increase gravity and you could still have life in the universe. Maybe increase it by a factor of 3,000. What tends to happen, though, is that, of course, we would get heavier and heavier and be weighed and weighed down, and you can with 40 noughts after it. So why isn't it? Naively, the probability that it would be in that 0 to 3,000 bracket is 3,000 divided by 10 to the 40, tiny number. 3 over 1 with 37 noughts after it. Tiny, tiny, tiny probability. The force, the strong nuclear force that holds atomic nuclei together. And that seems to be just right for carbon and oxygen to be manufactured in stars. That's where all the elements are built up. The Big Bang leaves you with hydrogen. Are built up by nuclear reactions inside stars where the temperatures are absolutely enormous, hundreds of millions of degrees. What we're trying to recreate at Culham at the moment, and with our fusion reactor, they've recently done got some interesting results there. Is who discovered it. It's none other than Fred Hoyle, the arch enemy of the Big Bang, actually, and atheist, who had an alternative to the Big Bang called the steady state, whereby he explained the expansion by saying that new matter comes into existence between the spaces as the galaxies move apart. And so the universe will look the same yesterday, today, and forever. That was defeated when the cosmic vacuum super intellect is monkeyed with physics, as well as with chemistry and biology. And there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. This is an atheist. The BBC and radio broadcasts in the late 40s, early 50s, talking about a super intellect behind the laws of nature. As John Polkinghorne says, laws of nature. If we were Thomas Aquinas, we might say, and this we call God. This is a very well-known cosmologist, Paul Davies, who's written a book called The Goldilocks Enigma, in which he says, like the porridge and the tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the universe seems to be just right for life in so many intriguing ways. If there weren't these life could not exist in the universe. It couldn't arise unless a whole host of these things were just right. It seems, as Hoyle put it, a put-up job. Why is the universe so special? Well, this is where we think, well, maybe it's designed by God, maybe some point within it. But then we need to look at the alternatives, as I mentioned before. Maybe we're wrong to say that these constants could be any different from what they're actually found to be. And people look for a so-called theory of everything, which calculates the constants. That doesn't seem to be very successful. And so what happens then is that people tend to say, actually, the constants can take any values, and they actually do, but in different universes. This is a so. There are puzzles for both these strategies. There are two things to consider about atheistic strategy. One, actually, is whether you might have a theory which calculates all the constants. If you did, it would be a puzzle as to why that set of laws gives rise to life. But then there's the secondary question. Well, why that set of laws? Can it be that there's only one set of laws, even if there were? That would be a problem. Why would that set of laws give rise to life? Because we can imagine completely lifeless. There are lots of universes that have different constants, maybe even different laws. But you still have a problem, because you have to ask then the question, why this multiverse as opposed to another multiverse? Because there are lots of ways of getting multiverses. This kind of toing and froing between these two ideas has gone on in cosmology for some years now. There's a chap across the way. You've got your x-axis, as it were, has got time, and your vertical axis, your y-axis, has got size. So in the very first tiny fraction of a second, according to inflation, down, but then just speeding up at the end, which I'll come to perhaps in a minute. In fact, I must race on. But anyway, what we found is that the density, in particular, being driven to the so-called critical value. So one of the fine-tunings is explained. Great, you might say. And in the particular way it does, and so on. So there are questions about it. So people go for versions of inflation which at different rates, different places, universes bubble up from other universes, and so on. Here's a chap called Leonard Susskind, who's one of the people responsible for something called string theory. According to string theory, matter isn't just point particles anymore. The first 1 divided by 1 with 43 noughts after it, fraction of a second from the origin. And that's needed. We need a theory, but can this be it? Well, it's made no predictions. And with the result that, not giving up on the theory, people move to different solutions to the equations, all giving rise to universes. What I'm describing here is where the theory has run ahead of the observations. There are brilliant observations that have been happening in cosmology in recent years. Fantastic things happening, but the theory has in some ways outrun it. And that reminds me of a quote from this famous Russian physicist, Lev Landau: "Cosmologists are often in error, but seldom in doubt." Rather fun quote, I think. Now, I think if you pose multiverses as an alternative to design by God, you've got lots of problems. I'm not give the lecture, you know, all sorts of possibilities. Once you enter this realm of infinitely many universes, or even very, very many large numbers of universes. For these kind of reasons, it's not a simple explanation, and scientists are very fond of the simplest explanation. You can give up on predicting if you find some strange feature in your laboratory, because you could say, well, maybe we're just in a universe where that sort of thing happens, because it will in some universes. And there's the factor called the cosmological constant, which is what gives rise to the anything like that, there would be no life possible in the universe. The universe would expand just in a fraction of a second. We'd be blown apart if we existed in the first place. If it's more than tiny, a few hundreds times the value, there couldn't be life. So that's a problem. And there's a problem to get an infinite universe. Get infinitely many universes. The universe might be finite, and that depends on that density that I was talking about, overall density. And there's the amount of order in the universe. You could think of a monkey sitting at a typewriter for eons on end, and eventually getting to be or not to be. That is the question. And suppose you say when the it would be sufficient for there to be one solar system. But we live in a universe with 1 with 10 to the 24 noughts after it galaxies, all with that same number of stars, vastly more than is needed. In terms of the monkey at the typewriter, that's much more like the complete works of Shakespeare, our universe, whereas a universe with just to be or and why the universe is that has that amount of order that I've been describing. So God then would provide not a scientific explanation, but a personal explanation. Science provides explanations of phenomena within the universe through scientific laws and initial conditions. God and science don't compete. God answers the why question. Why is there a universe at all? Why does it have this order and structure that we see? Science asks how matter and energy and so on behave. So if we think about the Big Bang, would be scientific alternatives, the Big Bang versus the steady state that Hoyle came up with, and the evidence decided in favor of the Big Bang. But there would be what one might call metaphysical explanations. God made it, or nobody made it, it just is, it's a brute fact, or just some kind of gigantic accident. They're different kinds of explanation, the scientific and the metaphysical. So what explains then why there's a universe, why it's the way it is, why maybe there's consciousness, why there's morality, why there's religious experience, why we can do science even. Not an alternative to science, it explains why we can do science. I mentioned the Imago Dei, we're made in the image of God. So let me just summarize again then. They're a good argument, and I think cosmological fine-tuning is a modern one that's been around, gosh, well, the first papers on it came out in the 70s, so it's been around for quite a long time, and it's still going strongly. And it's better to argue from general features, like the ordered structure, rather than individual features within it, which may have a scientific explanation. So I mentioned the human eye, the kind of, the Paley's watch and so on, not working in that sense, because science comes along with an explanation. So that would distinguish the kind of arguments I would be in favor of compared with the so-called intelligent design movement, capital I, capital D, in the United States, in the Discovery Institute in particular. And we're looking not absolute proof, but something like inference to the best explanation of what we're seeking, the evidence we're looking at. What hypothesis makes that evidence most probable. And there is, as I mentioned, the need to look at alternative hypotheses, like in the case of fine-tuning the multiverse. So science and theology are different, but with similarities. But they provide different kinds of explanation. Actually, John Polkinghorne had this lovely analogy, really, of the kettle boiling. Why is it boiling? Well, you've got bubbles forming, percolating upwards, and so on. Latent heat of steam. You've got all sorts of stuff going on scientifically, but there's a personal explanation. I want a cup of tea. And then those don't conflict. Evidence is important for both. I mentioned the limited scope of natural theology. I think, it gets you to a God, but the important knowledge that we really, really ultimately need is that of Christ, and God's revelation in the person of Christ, and our redemption and so on in him. But I think that, and I mentioned, I think ramified natural theology, where you use similar arguments, but in the historical realm. We can, as Aquinas said, came up near the beginning, we can know that God exists from reason, but know him in himself through self-revelation in Christ. And that's it.